We start with PSG. Well, we've known that they should be this good, but this week we saw really how good they are or should be in the Champions League. The question is, how did they get this good? Did we miss anything along the way, Lars?
Well, they have had a course correction in terms of how the team is run, in terms of how they recruit. And I mean, I struggle with this a little bit because I'm going to preface this by saying, I can't just immediately say nice things about PSG. We have to preface it by saying I still think this is kind of like a spiritually ugly project. You have a nation state going in, buying up a football club and pumping in so much money that the domestic competition becomes irrelevant. It's like, that's not a good thing for the sport. That's not what I want to see. But then because of that, because I have this natural antipathy towards this football club, it was kind of weirdly comfortable for me when they were ridiculous, when they were this sort of guest list of a football club that were not like just superstars that were there because of their names and not because they made sense as a team. And they would dominate domestically, of course, but they would always fall apart in Europe. And that was always very funny. And we've made fun of them a lot over the years on this pod. And for me, as someone who wants to dislike them, that was a very comfortable state of affairs. But now I have to acknowledge this is a really good team. This is a really interesting team. This is a team full of younger, athletic, dynamic, exciting players who play really well. I would make the case, even though they end up losing, because football can be silly sometimes. I think this is arguably the most impressive PSG performance I think I've seen since the Qataris took over, I would say. Because I think this is the first time I watched PSG against an absolute elite level opponent. You can make the case, certainly, for Liverpool being the best team in Europe so far this season. And watch them and just go, you know what? This is just a great football team. Full stop. This is a tremendous team now. With no sort of superstar nonsense, no spoilt idiots hanging around. Like, this is just a great football team. And it's kind of ridiculous that they then end up losing, but that's football sometimes. Sometimes football happens, but they were tremendous.
Yeah, and Lars isn't the only person who thinks that the best team lost against in their Champions League matchup with Liverpool this week. The Liverpool manager said pretty much the same thing. But I still don't understand how we've got here, because post Mbappe, Andy, post Messi, Neymar and Mbappe, you could argue, we thought that, PSG had been found out.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, as Lars said, they've gone away from being a brand to being a football club more now, which I think is really important. And I think you look at the signings they've made in recent times. They've been the signings they should make when you've got that resource, not the signings you could make when you've got that resource, which I think is a massive difference. So I think you can look at the Frenchification or the increasing Frenchification of that team, and you look at Barcola, look at Zaïre-Emery, but as well, you can see the amount of power that Luis Enrique has. When we think at Christmas, well, they should probably go out and buy themselves a proper centre forward in inverted commas, a penalty spot sort of zone occupier. And they go and buy Kvisha Kvaratskhelia, and you're like, hang on, what are they doing here? Because this is someone who is not only not an out-and-out striker, centre forward, but he's someone who we've seen play most of his great football in the same position as Bradley Barcola, who we want to see continuing to play the great football that he has. But I think you saw in this first half performance that was perfect, apart from the lack of a goal, that Kvaratskhelia, who's actually a surprise choice to start, it was expected in France that Zaïre-Emery would start as well, and I thought he was really good when he came on. But that idea that the way the front three worked was just a great view into the mind of Luis Enrique, I thought, because we know that Ousmane Dembele's been scoring all these goals in this calendar year, so he's been playing as this nominal centre forward, and funnily enough, that's meant he's been less involved in the game. He was more involved in this game than he's been in all those weeks that he's been scoring goals and goals and goals. So you start with him in the middle, Kvaratskhelia on the right and Barcola on the left. Funnily enough, the fixed point is on the left-hand side. Barcola is the only one that doesn't move position. So Trent Alexander-Arnold is dealing with Barcola 1 minute, and then he's got Barcola and Kvaratskhelia coming at him. And on the other side, You've got Andy Robertson, who's dealing with Kvaratskhelia, and all of a sudden he's dealing with Dembele because Dembele's out there, and that's one of the first big actions of the game when João Neves puts that one over the top because Dembele has Robertson on toes twice before getting the ball in. And I think ideally, in retrospect, Luis Enrique would rather have had João Neves playing the ball in and Dembele on the end of it than the other way round. But that's where we're seeing the Luis Enrique plan. That's where we're seeing the flexibility. And this is where we're seeing a proper football team rather than just a list of Instagrammable names.
Should we be adding the caveat, Lars, that, well, we've seen PSG come apart at this stage of the Champions League before, even though as complete as they may have been in this matchup against Liverpool, you know, they've been accused of bottling it in the past. They didn't do that this time around, but they certainly didn't do enough to get through, did they? The first leg.
They've come apart in large part because they've had a team that doesn't hang together. They've had a team where they've had 1, 2, or 3 players who just stand around and don't run when the opposing team has the ball. We've seen a PSG team where they effectively have 8 players when the opponent has the ball, and this is no longer the case. Now they're facing, paradoxically, they're kind of facing a different problem, which is they didn't score the goal. Like, they had all the domination, they had all the chances, but even though they're such a much more well-functioning team now, maybe we could say they lack a bit of cutting edge. I just think that's harsh because it's one game. They have been scoring a lot of goals recently, but they did lack someone who is just an absolute killer up front. Maybe one of Barcola, Doué, Dembele, Kvaratskhelia will grow into that role. That's entirely possible. But I think if they go out now, it's almost like the opposite thing to what it used to be. It used to be that they had absolutely unbelievably skillful individuals, but it made no sense as a team. Now they've gone very far in the other direction, and I think they're much better for it. Again, I do think watching them against Liverpool, my strong sensation is that this is the best PSG team I've seen in their modern era. Even like if you look at when they got to the final under Thomas Tuchel, that was kind of a... You know, that was the weird COVID year where they were in real trouble after losing the first leg against Dortmund, and then lockdown happened and they had this really weird second leg behind closed doors and everything was up in the air and they won, and then they beat Atalanta and Leipzig down in Lisbon in that sort of impromptu... Like, it was a really weird year. That was kind of the high watermark of PSG before this. I just think this team is really brilliant, but I think it comes down to one of my favorite sayings, which is that football is like chess but with dice. Like, you can make all the right moves but still roll a 1. And then you can have an opposing goalkeeper that keeps rolling a 6 in every situation in the game, and then there you are. I just think I have nothing to really criticize them for in this game. You can, like I said, like I was trying to do, feebly make the point that maybe if they had Mbappe hanging around up front, he would have scored one of those chances, but then maybe they wouldn't have been quite as good as a collective if they had that. So I just thought they were great and unfortunate.
That's always the question, isn't it? I think when something like this happens, which is so difficult to explain because they were so superior to Liverpool on the night and yet they didn't get the result, I think it's easy to, not easy, tempting. It's tempting to look for that explanation of, as Lars said, if they'd have had that killer. But they had that killer in the semi-finals last year. They had Kylian Mbappe then, and they missed chance after chance after chance despite being way better than them. And this has happened to PSG before, not just last season, but this season as well. And I think the interesting thing is, like, when you look at the previous game where this really happened, in the group stages, when I went to see them against at the Parc des Princes against Atletico Madrid, they're a better team for all of the game. They produced some dazzling football, and Atletico score a completely out of the blue winner with the last kick of the game in a very similar action to the one, a sort of long ball up the pitch from the keeper to the one which Liverpool scored last night. And they score it from Angel Correa scores from the same spot, cutting inside onto his left foot. And Gigi Donnarumma, who's arguably the last of the stars who's left, really could do a lot better. He could have done better last night. Yeah. He could have done better with that Correa shot back in November. So if we're talking about completely moving on from this stars model. Look, I don't want to lump it all on Donnarumma. If they'd have scored the goals that their play deserved, this would be absolutely irrelevant. But we've talked, Lars, again and again about how Donnarumma is kind of a little bit anachronistic in a Luis Enrique team. But also, if you're the goalkeeper for PSG, or if you're the goalkeeper for any dominant team, it's different to being a good goalkeeper who makes a load of good saves. You need to be someone who can stand there, do nothing for the entire game, and when you do have that one shot on target to save it.
Yeah.
So this is not even the bit about it's not even the bit about him not being Luis Enrique team level with his feet. Like twice this season, they've needed him to make a save right at the end of the game, and he hasn't been able to do it.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, no, I don't. I'm not a huge Donnarumma fan. I don't think he's really lived up to the potential he showed very, very, very early on, and it's possible that PSG should be looking elsewhere for their goalkeeper. I just also want to flag out it's the nature of the goal is really interesting. And it goes into, like, I raised the theory earlier, like, if they had this exact team, this exact performance, but with Mbappe still up front, would they have won the game? The problem with that, and I know it's me who brought that up, but, like, the problem with that line of thinking is, I think the reason they were so dominant against Liverpool was that Liverpool couldn't get out. Like Liverpool were not able to play out from the back the way they usually do. They were not able to move the ball through midfield the way they usually do. And they weren't able to do that because PSG were so aggressive, working so hard, were so good at blocking off passing lanes. And if you had Mbappe just hanging around up there, that would not be the case. You need 10 outfield players who work really hard off the ball to put that kind of performance together. And the goal Liverpool eventually score is quite instructive. They basically like, well, we can't play through these guys, so we're gonna have to chuck on Darwin Núñez and try to go over them, and that turns out to have worked in that moment. But that's in itself is a kind of is a chapeau to PSG, because again it's PSG being good in a completely different way to what they've been in years gone by. And it's an impressive performance. It's unfortunate for them that they've drawn Liverpool relatively early in the competition, because I do think Liverpool has been the best team in Europe this year. I hate to say it, but I don't have anything bad to say against PSG. It makes me feel very uncomfortable, as regular listeners will know. But this is where we are.
Yeah, this is where we are, and the tie isn't over yet, obviously.
I think it's still winnable for PSG.
It's still a lot in it. But how can we be sure, Andy? How can we be sure that this ain't the PSG evolved? The comparison you made with the final against Dortmund, the semi-final against Dortmund last year, it's a really valid one, isn't it? That, you got all the shots, you've had all the shots, and 10 on target in this out of 27 shots against Liverpool, 30 against Dortmund, I think it was, but you still haven't scored. How can we be sure that this PSG is the one that could carry itself right through to the final and maybe even win the thing?
Well, that's the Champions League for you. You can never be sure of a team until they actually win it.
That's what Dustin Springfield said.
Like with
David Cassidy as well.
It's like with Manchester City. You couldn't be sure they could win it until they actually won it in 2023. And that's what the Champions League is. I think because PSG have got such an unusual standalone economic model, as Lars says, I think we expect the unreasonable sometimes. And I'm as guilty of that as anyone else. I mean, earlier in the season when Luis Enrique was talking after the game they won at Salzburg, which really started to turn their game around, against feeble opposition who didn't have anywhere near their resources, Luis Enrique sat there and said in the press conference, well, we're still learning, we're a young team, we're gradual, this is a project that's in its early stages. And I'm sat there thinking, you're in your third season, and you've spent the sort of money that would, make most clubs blush. And are you serious? But actually, I think if you drill down and look at it, it is such a gradual process winning the Champions League, no matter how much money you have. And building a completely different culture, which he's doing, takes time. And sometimes part of that is, like I said, I think you could argue Donnarumma is something that's left over from the superstar culture. And on the other part of that goal, Nuno Mendes, who has a brilliant game, who adds to the attack, who has Mo Salah in his pocket. I've never seen anyone play Mo Salah like that this season. He was outstanding defensively. And then he nods off and lets Harvey Elliott give him the slip after
Took a nap.
He's just come on. And he will be probably sitting there this morning thinking, how did that happen? Because if you look at the moment when Alisson plays the ball, and if you look at the moment again where Darwin receives the ball, in both of those instances, Nuno Mendes is in a perfect position and he's got a massive advance on Harvey Elliott. And all of a sudden, Harvey Elliott's over his shoulder scoring the goal. So I think whatever he cost, you have to realise that he's still learning.